Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, as the case may be. Lovely to see you all. My name is Joel Wainwright. I'm a professor at Ohio State University in the United States, and today it is my distinct pleasure to serve as the host for this event, which looks to be very exciting. We have a pair of speakers to join us today. But before I introduce them, I just want to say a quick thanks to the comrades at the Marxism and Disability Network, who were really the people who put all of this together today, not me. So thanks very much to them for this event and for all the exciting events that they've organized for 2025. Today we have two speakers, Matthew Rozsa and Bernardo Paci. And what we're going to do is have Matthew speak first, and then Bernardo will follow, and then afterwards we'll have time for a Q&A. So just a brief word of introduction for Matthew. Matthew Rozsa is a professional writer. His work has appeared in numerous outlets, national media, and with Salon. And he's presently working on a book, which is in contract with Beacon Press, which carries the exciting title Neurosocialism, in which he argues that autistic people, like the author, struggle under capitalism. And his book goes on to explain why and how neurosocialism is a crucial organizing principle for those of us on the left. Additionally, Matthew on the side is also presently working on a series of programs or pieces for the outlet Democracy at Work under the title of Backseat Socialism. So keep your eyes out for that. It'll be coming out soon. Today, Matthew's presentation is entitled, quote, Why Being Neurodivergent Necessitates Socialist Solutions. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you everyone who is attending today. Um, as this slideshow indicates, I'm going to discuss Marxism and disability rights. Um, and so, change. The first subject I want to bring up in my speech is what it means to be neurodiverse, because the term neurodiversity is being used more prevalently. This is a very good thing because the concept of neurodiversity is crucial to achieving social justice for people who are autistic, people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. These are all conditions that fall under the umbrella of neurodivergent. And the core concept of being neurodivergent is that when your neurology deviates from what is considered normal, that this isn't a problem that you need to fix, it is a problem that society needs to fix. What we challenge fundamentally is the concept of a normal brain. We argue that the mere notion that certain neurological types are quote unquote normal is a capitalist construct created for the purpose of helping corporations and others who benefit from the end stage capitalist status quo to continue with a system that allows them to literally profit, even though doing so is often at our own expense. Change. So, one of the ways that this is at our expense is that in order to thrive in a capitalist system, you have to mask. If you are neurodivergent and you possess certain traits, you are required to conceal who you are, those aspects of you that come naturally, for fear that doing so will literally hurt you economically. And I'm using the word literally in this on this occasion because people need to know that the stakes are truly that high for the neurodivergent community. It reminds me of why I chose the title Backseat Socialism for my column. It's based on a 2009 comedy sketch by the group Whitest Kids You Know. And in it, the late comedian Trevor Moore says the only reason capitalism works is because it plays on man's biggest flaw, namely greed. And in terms of people who are disabled in the ways that people who are neurodivergent are often classified as disabled, quote, masking increases anxiety by worrying about what other people think. It leads to perfectionist tendencies and low self-esteem. It's mentally exhausting to give so much energy to pretend to be someone you're not, and people often feel like imposters in their own lives, constantly afraid of people finding out about their ADHD. That's from the book Unapologetically ADHD by Nikki Kinzer and Pete D. Wright. And this is something that we need to remember as we critique capitalism, that the one of the main tolls that it takes on people who are neurodivergent is the emotional and mental health toll of constantly needing to mask change. Another concept that we need to accept is the fact that capitalism itself it is informing this science, so to speak, about understanding neurodivergent neurology. So now I'm going to quote from the book Empire of Normality by the neurodivergent philosopher Robert Chapman, who currently teaches at Durham University. He says that in ancient Greece, health was understood as a form of harmony, such as through the philosopher Hippocrates, and it was also understood as such elsewhere in the world. This persisted until at least the 17th century. We then have to turn to the French philosopher René Descartes to see the broader shift in Enlightenment thinking about the body and health. For Descartes, the body was reconceptualized as a machine. In this view, health was no longer a matter of harmony, but rather a mechanistic matter of working properly. And that is, for instance, as we see on screen, more generally, the key limitation of existing neurodiversity theory and activism is that it is more focused on changing our thinking and attitudes rather than on changing material conditions. Chapman's observation here is key to the concept of neurosocialism, because while many who advocate for the neurodiverse community do so with the best intentions, when you do so without acknowledging how capitalism puts us at a permanent structural disadvantage, you miss a key component of both how we struggle and what solutions are needed to address our concerns um, and change. So, one solution that I offer is the concept of radical acceptance, which I take again from Kinzer and Wright's book Unapologetically ADHD. They cite the famous scene in the movie Good Will Hunting, in which Robin Williams reassures Matt Damon's character, who, if not neurodivergent, is certainly coded as neurodivergent, for blaming himself for the abuse he suffered as a child, repeatedly saying it's not your fault. The underlying idea presented through that scene is that people who are neurodivergent, instead of internalizing the self-hatred that exists as a result of capitalism and one's struggles to compete in a capitalist society, should instead feel as if the way they are is okay, that they should accept what they cannot change about their neurology and instead fight for what they can change, namely broader social acceptance. To quote cognitive scientist Dr. Maureen Dunn in The Neurodiversity Edge, one in every five people you see each day may be living in a world defined by systematic and counterproductive exclusion from the opportunity to productively contribute to society. In terms of human capital potential, this is a devastating failure. Morally, it's a plague of injustice. And in her book, Autism is Not a Disease, the 23-year-old copywriter and journalist who is also autistic, Jodi Hare, writes, neurodivergent people and their families are being failed every day, and we will continue to fail them until we begin factoring in them into the creation of new systems. And in his book, We're Not Broken, Michael Garcia, a neurodivergent journalist and senior Washington correspondent at The Independent, said that autistic people are often the victims of what former President George W. Bush speechwriter Michael Gerson called the soft bigotry of low expectations, meaning they are expected to be unable to work or only able to work jobs that pay sub-minimum wage. And in case you need any proof that these accusations are correct, I refer to the recent quote by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., President Trump's chief health policy advisor, who refers to autism as an epidemic that needs to be cured and says that autistic people will never be able to pay taxes or hold a job, and some can't even wipe themselves. Change. So there is a lot of data reinforcing the observations I've made in a study that was released by the National Autistic Society in 2024. 2,449 autistic adults were surveyed, and through the survey, it was ascertained that they struggle massively and disproportionately with finding stable jobs or with even obtaining employment in the first place. They concluded that people who are on the autism spectrum are disproportionately likely to be unemployed or underemployed and to struggle to obtain work. In another study, 2024, released in the Journal of Attention Disorders, this one surveying 320 post-secondary students for ADHD symptoms, it found, quote, that inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity symptoms showed strong stability across the 15-year period. Additionally, inattention symptoms during emerging adulthood and early middle adulthood were consistently associated with poorer life success, that is, lower relationship and career satisfaction, particularly for men. Uh, Change. Now, the counter to this is the neurotypical argument that really we just need to find the neurodivergent people who are most capable of being productive. Individuals like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, who have been described as autistic, even though they have not made any such diagnosis public, reinforce this notion. And in fact, through their own public personas, especially Musk, try to claim that they are examples of autistic excellence and proof that autistic people thrive in capitalism. But in fact, through their actions, they reinforce neurotypical assumptions. They demand that autistic people define their ability to succeed within the narrow confines of what capitalists can profit from. And in so doing, regardless of whether they are in fact on the spectrum, which is highly debatable, they are deliberately reinforcing a status quo that disadvantages autistic people. To demonstrate this point, I'm quoting a famous essay by Eric Engdahl that parodies how neurotypical behavior would be described by neurodivergent people if neurotypicality was pathologized. In this quote, Eric Engdahl humorously writes, neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Neurotypical individuals assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one. NTs find it difficult to be alone. They are often intolerant of minor differences in others. When in groups, NTs are socially and behaviorally rigid and frequently insist upon the performance of dysfunctional, destructive, and even impossible rituals as a means of maintaining group identity. They find it difficult to communicate directly and have a much higher incidence of lying as compared to persons on the autism spectrum. And let me tell you, those traits all describe the so-called neurodivergent capitalists like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, as well as advocates of autism and capitalism like Peter Thiel. It is not a movement that advocates for our best interest. What is in our best interest is receiving a robust social safety network to provide us with monetary support when we need it and also to protect our rights. Change. To quote Jodi Hare from her book Autism is Not a Disease, when we trust neurodivergent people's accounts of their own lives and experiences, we can use this information to understand what more inclusive and useful research might look like. Instead of continuing the pursuit of possible causes and cures, a la RFK Jr., we have the opportunity to ask what research would be most beneficial for neurodivergent people. And to quote Dr. Dunn from the Neurodiversity Edge, the larger business world is badly lagging behind the curve in aligning organizational values with authentic neurodiversity inclusion, especially with respect to how that inclusion may represent a significant strategic asset in navigating the landscape of inevitable long-term transformational change ahead of us. In other words, we need to listen to neurodivergent people. We need to accommodate the needs as articulated by the neurodivergent community. And they're not asking to be pathologized. They're not asking to be cured. We want to be treated as equals in this society, to have our social justice rights protected, and to receive the same access to material benefits based on the quality of our work as the neurotypical community. Change. So this brings me to the most explicitly political point that I'm making. We need to support actual Marxist politicians. individuals who challenge the capitalist status quo by accurately diagnosing what it is that ails us, and not simply people who are centrist or moderately liberal or, as Chapman writes, neo-Thatcherist. Obviously, he's referring to the British Prime Minister from the 1980s who moved that country's politics to the right. But this observation applies to political movements everywhere in the world. So when he says the rise of neo-Thatcherism, you can substitute that phrase with MAGA or AFD in Germany or Likud in Israel or any other right-wing movement. The rise of neo-Thatcherism, whereby neurodiversity advocacy is turned into a business-oriented program for unearthing neurodivergent strengths or superpowers and then mining those with those strengths, may be useful for those neurodivergent people it helps into jobs. However, Chapman's observation is this does not work for the vast majority of neurodivergent people who, due to their lack of privilege, will still fundamentally be defined by the discrimination they face at the hands of neurotypical employers. Um, and so the important thing in that regard is to support politicians who advocate for increased welfare benefits to those who need it, who advocate for free healthcare, who advocate for strengthening the Americans with Disabilities Act to protect the rights of neurodivergent people who are classified as disabled when they face discrimination in employment or in education or elsewhere in life. Change. Another concept that I want to embrace, and this is something I recently wrote about for the journal Nonprofit Quarterly, which it advocates for social justice causes for nonprofits and activist organizations. In that article, I spoke with former Social Security Commissioner Martin O'Malley, and he described how under President Trump, the law is being casually broken in order to persecute immigrants right now, but eventually we assume to persecute other people. Autistic individuals, including myself, are concerned that the talk of a registry and of cracking down on our community in general puts us in danger. And so one of the things that O'Malley and I urge for immigrants who face discrimination, but I would extend this to everyone who is facing Trump's lawlessness, including possibly neurodivergent individuals, that they do have rights. They can advocate that state and local law enforcement fight for them, that if people who work for Trump break the law in order to advance his agenda, they can be charged with crimes. To quote O'Malley from Nonprofit Quarterly, I would strongly encourage attorneys general and local states attorneys to file kidnapping charges against those who would kidnap people in our country in violation of every principle of due process and habeas corpus that has applied here ever since our independence from Britain. This argument, I can't stress enough, does not only apply to people who are persecuted for being immigrants. It applies to anyone who is legitimately wronged, whose legal rights are violated by this administration. The Supreme Court may have provided Trump with a carte blanche in terms of receiving immunity from prosecution due to him being president, but that protection does not extend to his goons. They can be stopped. And this is something that we should all be mindful of as we protect our rights in the United States. Um, Change.
Matthew, 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. I have about 4 minutes left, so very convenient. Um, I am writing a book called Neurosocialism, which, as Professor Wainwright very kindly said, is going to be published by Beacon Press probably in 2027. And I am going to soon have a Substack at Democracy at Work called Backseat Socialism, which advocates for a socialist approach to all political subjects, not just neurodiversity rights. In conclusion, what I would say is this. We are currently at a crucible in human history. There are far-right movements taking power from the United States and Hungary to Russia and Israel. We need to fight this war against them on many different fronts, But on top of that, as income inequality gets worse, as climate change gets worse, as plastic pollution and other forms of ecocide get worse, as white supremacy and patriarchy and other forms of systemic discrimination get worse, the need to address the root cause, which is end stage capitalism and the way it privileges the few over the many, must be fundamentally addressed. I do not claim that neurodivergent people are the only victims of end stage capitalism. I don't even claim that we are the primary victims of end stage capitalism. What I do point out is that we are victimized by end stage capitalism in a very unique way, and the solutions for our problems in end stage capitalism must be addressed. I would also point out that regardless of whether one believes neurodivergent people have superpowers, to quote Greta Thunberg, or whether it should simply be viewed as an innocuous neurological difference, the reality is our perspective on the world is distinct, and therefore our critiques of capitalism can be uniquely valuable. So, in conclusion, I urge all people in the neurodivergent community to mobilize behind left-wing candidates and causes, to depathologize neurodiversity in casual conversation and in greater public discourse, and to not allow far right wingers like Elon Musk to define how autism is viewed to the rest of the world. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I see that some hands have gone up. At this time, we're not going to take questions. Oh, looks like those are all hands that are clapping. Excuse me. What we're going to do is have our second paper, and then we'll take questions. So if you did have questions arise listening to Matthew speak, please jot those questions down or make a note to yourself. And then in just a few minutes, when Bernardo is finished, we'll have an opportunity to speak with both authors. So I'm delighted to introduce now Bernardo Paci, our second speaker today, presently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Naples, as well as a member of the, excuse me, as well as a member of the group of critical theory of society at the University of Milan. His research interests focus on critical theory, postcolonialism, and global intellectual history. And he has a recent publication in disability studies that was published in Italian, if you read Italian, in Minority Reports, issue 16. Bernardo's paper for us today is entitled Past in the Present or Future in the Present: Temporality, Cultural Representations of Autism, and the Social Division of Labor. Thank you. Over to you, Bernardo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you also for the invitation. Good afternoon or evening, based on where all of you are. What I'm going to present today is part of a broader ongoing inquiry that I've been conducting in the last couple of years, and the inquiry concerns the relationship between contemporary representations of autism, also of neurodivergence in general, but especially of autism, and the transformations of the capitalist division of labor. So I just would like to add that also I will begin with some global considerations, and I also believe that what I'm going to say has some relevance in most contexts, at least in Western world. Most of my empirical references will mainly concern the Italian context, in as much as it is the one with which I am most familiar with, and I think it also offers some interesting examples. So the point of the paper is the growing presence and visibility of neurodivergent people, and in particular autistic people, within the global workforce, between 15% and 20%, according to some 2020 estimates, which were published on the British Medical Bulletin. As a matter of fact, during the last decade, the number of initiatives aimed at integrating, as it is usually said, autistic people within the labor market has significantly grown in many Western countries. Considering the US, for example, we could think of the portal The Spectrum Careers, founded in 2016 and promoted by Autism Speaks, one of the US leading organizations in the field that has been efficaciously defined as the autism industrial complex by Alicia Broderick some years ago, or of the many initiatives put in place by big tech companies such as Microsoft to specifically hire autistic people. Now, I think that two common assumptions concerning this development should be critically revised. This is not just my opinion, but I'll just restate it. First, we should contest first that this is a plainly progressive step toward inclusion. And second, that this inclusion concerns neurodivergent workers in a homogeneous way. In fact, not only this is rather a form of differential inclusion, furthermore, the process in general is not neutral, but structured by the political economy of labor and by cultural logics of segmentation, hyper-exploitation, and also the politicization. So at the same time, cultural representations of autism and neurodivergence have multiplied and transformed in recent years, well beyond cultural production in a strict sense, or the mass media, investing fields ranging from the scientific discourse to corporate and institutional language. Nevertheless, the connection between these representations and the transformations of the social division of labor, and more specifically, how this concretely affects the growing number of neurodivergent workers, has not been analyzed in depth yet. To make sense of this connection, I adopt a historical materialist approach. Clearly, by this, I do not mean that my goal is to reduce cultural representations to a mechanical reflection of economic structures, but on the contrary, drawing on the work of Cedric Robinson and later theories of racial capitalism, I argue that, for example, stereotypes should not be reduced to cognitive shortcuts or individual prejudices, but understood as constitutive operations within capitalist development. In other words, as the result of material and social processes that shape the division of labor, define the boundaries of exploitation, and govern the distribution of recognition and value. So this approach allows us to trace how different stereotypes concerning autism and neurodivergence more broadly contribute to fragmenting and segmenting the workforce and organizing labor along hierarchies of productivity, or rather perceived productivity sometimes. However, the issue should be criticized anyway. Employability and deviance. In this sense, it should not be forgotten that, as noted among the others by Robert Chapman, the very historical formation of disability as a category is entangled with the emergence of the capitalist labor relation, and in fact, it is well known that modern definitions of disability emerged alongside the distinction between the employable and unemployable, and the accompanying moral taxonomy of the deserving versus undeserving poor. In this sense, disability also appears as a labor-related sorting mechanism from the point of view of capital, a mechanism that is foundational to the making of the wage labor system and the proletariat itself. Similarly, psychiatric taxonomies, such as the autism spectrum, are structured around distinctions of functioning, as we well know, that reproduce this historical logic, reflecting the needs of labor management rather than being merely neutral clinical tools. But I also hypothesize that different stereotypes concerning neurodivergence, as articulated through the division of labor, can be read through the lens of temporality, as mentioned in the subtitle of my presentation. More specifically, drawing on the work of some scholars like Vittorio Morfino, who in turn has drawn on concepts such as the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous proposed by Ernst Bloch, but also the concept of past in the present to describe how third world countries, countries from the global south, better to say, are framed within development economics, a concept proposed by Dipesh Chakrabarty. Based on this, I employ the concept of plural temporalities. That is to say that capitalism does not produce a unified time, but overlapping and conflicting temporal orders. And through this lens, it can be seen that neurodivergent, and especially, perhaps not especially, autistic people are often figured either as anachronistic forms of past in the present, atavistic remnants of a pre-modern past from the evolutionary point of view, or on the contrary, portrayed as hyper-modern, almost post-human forms of future in the present, machinic, robotic, and so on. So I will begin by considering the first figure before. So autism as past in the present. This representation is particularly prevalent in relation to neurodivergent people employed in unskilled or low-skilled work, usually underpaid or not paid at all sometimes. Initially, but I suspect not only this concerns, Matthew was saying something similar before, if I have well heard, this concerns the vast majority of autistic workers, especially those who are not categorized in terms of high functioning. Many initiatives, private, public, and mixed, exist with the explicit objective to include these autistic people in the job market. Inclusion is the key word in this kind of discourses. To make some examples, I know from Italy, there is the pizzeria Pizza Out, which is currently very, very famous. But also the initiative Autistici e Giardinieri, that is autistics and gardeners, organized by Louis, a private university in Rome, where autistic people work as gardeners for free. But there is also the Autism Friendly Beach project started in 2015 and funded by the European Union, an important part of which consists in the training of young autistic people as junior lifeguard assistants through internship contracts. And about this, you should know that the average salary for interns in Italy is currently 638 euros per month. But often they are not paid at all. Other cases could be cited, other initiatives of this kind, for example, Meccanicotto and Chiccocotto of the Cotolengo School in Turin, respectively aimed at training young autistic people as assistant mechanics with the sponsorship of Fiat Chrysler automobiles and as vending machine loaders. So in these cases, the medical model of disability, or in some cases, at least around here, a sort of paternalistic Catholic pre-medical model prevails in informing the representation of autistic workers. These initiatives are accompanied usually by a rhetoric of benevolence, of sacrifice, caregiving, and more or less explicitly, they substantially assume that the scope of this inclusion they provide is to prevent autistic people from becoming burdens for their families and the society at large. So the representation of autistic people in this context draws on a long history. In previous research, which I presented in November in another event, I reconstructed the genealogy of what I have provisionally called the Lockean triangle, an equivalence first proposed, as long as I know, by John Locke, but which recurs throughout modern philosophy and then also psychiatry, between, in Locke's words, children, savages, and idiots. So a mechanism through which each of these three figures is used to explain each other, therefore reducing both mentally and relationally disabled people, neurodivergent people, as well as non-European people to a sort of earlier stage of development or of evolution. Locke is the first to make this equivalence, but it can be found also in authors such as Giambattista Vico, Auguste Comte, Sigmund Freud, Eugen Bleuler, the inventor of the category of autism, Piaget, but it also exists in current days in modern neurosciences. Consider, for example, the so-called solitary forager theory for autistic people, or the hunter-gatherer theory for ADHD people, for example. Now, this conceptual triangle has served to naturalize developmental hierarchies by situating certain subjects, racialized, colonized, disabled, as existing on a lower rank, an earlier stage, as I was saying, of human evolution or cognitive maturity. So in the case of autism, this results in persistent tropes of infantilization and primitivism. The autistic person becomes a figure of arrested development, situated in a different historical time, one that must be brought into modernity, or neuromodernity if you want, through education, discipline, care, or even civilization. And in this sense, Dipesh Chakrabarty's critique of historicism and his formulation of the metaphor of the imaginary waiting room of history perhaps could help illuminate how autistic people are thus often cast as non-coeval with neurotypical subjects from the point of view of cognitive development, always in transition, never fully modern somehow. However, the most important point is that this temporality justifies a specific labor regime, that of permanent tutelage. So the autistic person is represented as incapable of self-management, perpetually in need of supervision. Even when formally employed, their work is, sorry, I have skipped a page, as I would say, pedagogical, in pedagogical rather than in economic terms. They are not seen as workers, but as patients or eternal students. So here inclusion functions as containment, and the aim of work is not the salary, but inclusion, and with inclusion it is meant something like disciplining and civilization. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, we find the construction of autism as future in the present. This applies primarily to autistic people in high-skilled jobs, especially in IT and digital industries. In this framing, autism is not a sign of deficiency, but of superiority, a kind of biological optimization for post-industrial labor. The stereotypical autistic tech worker is hyper-focused, emotionally detached, loyal, resistant to distraction, and social manipulation. For example, IT companies like Auticon, which is a German company, but which works in many European countries, including Italy, have explicitly mobilized this image. In an article posted on their corporate blog a couple of years ago, which was significantly titled, "Can an Artistic Labor Force Close the Tech Talent Gap?" They wrote, and I quote, "Today, technology has become essential for every business looking to reduce manual labors, improve efficiency, and compete on a global scale. This means that technologies like artificial intelligence, big data and analytics, and cloud computing are becoming essential parts of every company. To stay on top of the game, a lot of tech talent is required. Unfortunately, there is an ever-growing tech talent gap, and the lack of a qualified workforce is a problem to tackle in the coming years. How can this tech talent gap be filled? While outsourcing to economically disadvantaged countries, lower costs for some companies, there is also a largely unexplored labor force that holds a lot of potential people on the autism spectrum." End quote. So here the employment of an autistic labor force is openly presented both as a potential solution to the growing demand for a qualified workforce in high technology intensive sectors, and as an alternative to outsourcing in global South countries. In fact, offering a depiction of these workers as a reserve army of labor, which is exactly Chapman's thesis, and which also incidentally raises suspicion about the actual salary level of these workers, since they are considered to be competitive with workers from the global south from the point of view of cost. But the same article also presents further features of the already mentioned autistic stereotype, which in my opinion shows quite clearly, among the other things, the concrete risks of occupational segregation it entails for autistic workers in the IT sector. As a matter of fact, these workers are described as naturally endowed with, I quote again, sustained concentration and perseverance, even when tasks are repetitive, end quote, which clearly tends to justify the assignments of the most repetitive and alienating tasks to them. As well as, and this is the very classic stereotype, abilities in computer science, engineering, and data processing, which is quite funny for an autistic person working in the humanities, which is really, really afraid of numbers, as I am. But well, we know that's the classic stereotype. In this framework, autistic people are often represented as tending to feel, if not to actually be, closer to machines than to human beings. And while a certain tendency to represent workers as machine-like has always been part of capitalistic political economy, this seems to apply in a particularly intense manner to autistic people in these sectors, especially in these sectors. So even beyond representations of this kind within general cultural production, such as TV series, movies, books, and so on, this kind of portrayal can be traced also in the psychiatric discourse. In 2018, for example, the French psychiatrist Frédéric Tordeau has dedicated a scientific paper to this issue titled La personne autiste et sa machine, the autistic person and its machine. Here, not only autistic children are represented as innately and homogeneously interested in machines since their birth. The cause of such a fascination would be, for the author, situated in an actual kinship, parenté, he says. In his own words, which I translate from French, quote, the autistic person deliberately seeks refuge within the technological environment inasmuch as the characteristics of the machine resonate with the characteristics of their physical world, and even more explicitly, another quote. That is to say that certain functions of technology are represented by the autistic person in a manner similar to some of their own internal functions, end quote.
Bernardo, I'm sorry for the 2-minute warning.
Oh, okay, I'll try to accelerate. So the common characteristics he identifies are, for example, automatism, stereotypes, monotony, functioning like a program, the avoidance of overloads, etc., etc. Now, this is not just dehumanizing, because this is dehumanizing, but the fact is that this kind of discourse can be encountered within the discourse of corporate diversity management, where it is posed as a positive and inclusive description, according to which the autistic worker is expected to conform to a narrow machinic ideal, endlessly productive, loyal, cheap. Choose what could be described as a neoliberal capture of the neurodiversity paradigm, or even as a passive revolution, aimed in Gramscian terms, aimed to absorb and neutralize the growing demands of neurodivergent political movements, and perhaps also of the very social model of disability. The discourse of diversity is thus employed by companies in order to construct and legitimize the hyper-exploitation of neurodivergent workers. I'll skip a couple of examples I had here because we have not time. I wanted to quote from this pamphlet produced by an association of autistic people, which talks about autism as an asset in the company, but let it go. Yeah, okay, my conclusion. The political effects of this dual logic are serious and go well beyond the differential inclusion of neurodivergent workers as a whole in the capitalist labor market. On the one hand, we see a segmentation of the neurodivergent population according to economic productivity, perceived or real. On the other, we see an erosion of collective identity and political solidarity, potentially at least. Those who are characterized as forms of future in the present may feel exceptional, distancing themselves from others deemed less functional or more impaired, giving rise to a sort of labor aristocracy. And meanwhile, those characterized in terms of past in the present and placed in therapeutic or pedagogical labor relations are excluded from full worker status altogether, including those forms of recognition that should accompany this social relationship. However, as said, this differentiation should not be taken as a simple case of uneven access, but borrowing the term from Silvia Federici, who referred it to racial and sexual differences, as the result of processes of accumulation of differences. The systematic production of stratifications within the working class designed to inhibit solidarity and reproduce capitalist control. Countering these processes does appear as a fundamental step, both for the theoretical construction of a neurodivergent Marxism, or neurosocialism, borrowing the term from Matthew, as proposed by, perhaps, no, it's not a synonym, I'm sorry, but, and also for the practical task of building concretely the organization of neurodivergent workers. So for that purpose, other than reclaiming the radical roots of the neurodiversity paradigm and opposing the, let's call it, denial of coevalness that appear to characterize cultural representations of neurodivergent workers, it is also necessary to reaffirm neurodivergence itself as a potential site of conflict within capitalist production, rather than a mere identity or difference that can be readily transformed into assets for corporation. In other words, we do not need forms of celebration of neurodivergence as a market asset or as yet another object of corporate diversity policies, but concrete structures of autonomy and solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo, for a second stimulating paper.